KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. This year, I'm also doing a fellowship at the University of North Carolina's Center for Information Technology and Public Life and the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center. Today, I am very pleased to have back an early Hearsay Culture guest, former colleague, fellow of mine way back in the mid 2000s when we were unmolded clay, entering the academic world. My friend and colleague, Professor Harry Surden from the University of Colorado. Harry is also has recently been named the Associate Director of Stanford's Codex, which is well known to Hearsay Culture listeners for the work that it has done over a period of a couple of decades now, at least, involving technology, computers, and law. Very recently, in fact, Josh Walker was on the show, who's also been affiliated with Codex for a number of years. Harry is, among other things, and not only an intellectual property law scholar, but also one of the nation's academic experts for sure in artificial intelligence. And Harry has a name for himself that precedes this work, but has posted some very, I think, useful and educational videos on YouTube that demonstrated, particularly when ChatGPT was foisted onto the world back in November 22, how ChatGPT could work through legal problems and work through the law. And through those videos, Harry has been able to, I think, educate a lot of people on what the technology is capable of and what its risks are. Since ChatGPT launched, Harry has been traveling the globe, literally, talking about this work, talking about it with his background, which is very important in legal informatics and artificial intelligence, and the fact that he has a background in computer science. He worked as a software engineer at Cisco Systems and Bloomberg LP. And I should also, as long as I'm disclosing more bias caveats, he and I are also both graduates of Cornell University. So Harry is a friend, but not just a friend, and a friend of Hearsay Culture. Harry is also one of the nation's experts on this technology, AI generally, and generative AI more specifically. So we're going to dive into some of these issues today. Harry is joining us via Zoom. We're recording on April 4th, 2024. Harry, thank you so much for coming back on Hearsay Culture.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Harry, I've had a number of guests on the show over the last couple of months talking about AI for obvious reasons. And I've asked everyone the same question initially, which is how do you define artificial intelligence broadly, particularly for a lay audience? How do you describe it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I like to think of artificial intelligence in the following way, which is when computers do tasks that when people do those same tasks involve intelligence. So we often think of intelligence as involving a suite of higher order brain or cognitive activities. These include problem solving, reasoning, visual and spatial perception, language generation, understanding, creativity, etc. These are a bunch of higher order characteristics typically associated with the more recent evolutionary parts of the brain. So when we find a task that when humans do it, whether it's playing chess or driving a car or creating art or understanding or generating language, when humans do that task, it involves some or many of these aspects of intelligence. So artificial intelligence is getting computers to doing any or one of these tasks that we normally associate with intelligence. Now, the important thing to know, though, is when computers do them, they do them very differently than humans do them. So we can have computers drive cars and computers can play chess. So they can do these intelligence tasks, but they do it very differently than what from a mechanical level than when humans do it. So that's my general definition.
Now we have, and I by the way, and I want to come to your work that you did prior on autonomous vehicles, which is what we had discussed on the show years ago. But before I get to that, then we have generative AI, right? Which is a subset of artificial intelligence. And so how do you describe that?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence can be used in lots of different tasks. It can be used for prediction, say predicting maybe the outcome of a legal case, or it can be used for playing chess or all these different things. There's a certain subset of tasks that are associated with human creativity. So these are art, music, video, language generation and understanding. So when humans create texts, it's an act of generation of creation. So generative AI is the broad subset of AI tasks that involve tasks that are normally associated with human creativity, as opposed to AI being involved in prediction or driving cars or some other non-creative task.
Now, I was listening to a forum that today, again, April 4th, 2024, that Mark Rottenberg's new organization put on this morning. I don't, you may have heard about it or attended it, but regardless, Joanne Bryson, who I think we both know, was kind of doing her overview of some of the regulatory issues. And again, this is kind of a big picture question, but she made a really good point that I was thinking would be a good question to ask you, which is this: it seems like right now, right? All that people are talking about is generative AI. And not
Mhm.
only that, but all the regulation now that's being proposed in the United States, in the EU, and elsewhere is focused on generative AI. And her point was generally that it's too narrow a frame. In other words, we should be, I think the implication was we should be thinking about AI more broadly and not just generative AI. And before we get into, I don't want to get into the regulations just yet, but I'm curious, in light of these two definitions, what you think of that critique. Are we right now too focused on thinking about generative AI to the exclusion of other uses of AI and other ways that AI are operating?
I think Joanna has a point, but I think it helps to have a little clarification why we're so focused on AI, generative AI in particular. And the reason is that there's been a large leap in capabilities since 2002. So, just to give a little background of the kind of the techniques of AI, just a short history. So maybe since in the first, 50 or 60 years of AI, it was dominated by what's known as rules-based or symbolic AI, and largely it involved manually crafted rules or symbols that computers could reason about. This was somewhat useful, and I'm talking here 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but it never really amounted to all that much. Around 2000, you had a different strain of AI that was called machine learning, which was AI that could learn patterns from data. So rather than humans manually creating rules, if then, if this or else, the machine itself, these are pattern detectors, would detect these new ways of automating on their own. And that was still pretty interesting, but still quite limited. So up until about, I want to say 2018 or so, AI was still, and particularly this machine learning approach, was very useful in certain limited tasks like identifying pictures or things of that nature, but not very good at things like language understanding, art generation, or arbitrary thinking or reasoning. Now, what happened around 2022, exemplified by ChatGPT, the first version, which came out in November 22, 3.5, was the first general purpose AI system that could reason and think about language. And this was kind of astonishing because you can ask ChatGPT just about any topic and it will give you a sensible, if not always accurate, answer. So we'll talk about the accuracy later, but just the fact that an AI system could pertinently and responsively engage with language. And the thing about language, it's the foundation of everything else. Language is what humans do to convey and implement knowledge. So if you can get a system that can manipulate, generate language, then you've built this foundational thing that can help you develop in every other area since it's the foundation. The other interesting thing were that there were these emergent properties that happened were unexpected. So there had been a lot of work on they call this natural language understanding. So natural language is what computer scientists call English or French, the ordinary languages that we talk, as opposed to computer or formal languages. So computers up until 2020 were very bad at understanding ordinary speech. They get things wrong all the time. They couldn't have a conversation very long before they'd break. But in 2022, they started getting very good. And they also exhibited these emergent properties that they weren't trained for, the ability to reason, to problem solve, things of that nature. These have only gotten better. There's been new models in the last year. There's something called GPT-4. A company called Anthropic has something called Claude 3 and Opus. Google has released Gemini. So I think getting back to your question, why it is important to focus on generative AI, because it has gotten so much better than all the other areas of AI, and it's really foundational to much of human society. So I think it's both appropriate to focus on generative AI as much as it is, but we don't want to miss all the AI more narrow applications that are happening out there.
Is so is it an error for policymakers right now to be, assuming you buy the premise, saying let's focus on generative AI to the exclusion of other uses, because we don't have a lot of laws, right, that focus on AI, right? We've got a few in the United States, right? Something like, maybe, but not really, something like BIPA, some of the, the state laws that in a couple of states that deal with like privacy aspects of health that have some data, aggregation and AI concepts, but we really don't have the regulation. And so diving in first with generative AI, is there a risk associated with it, notwithstanding the fact that it makes sense, or do you see that as kind of an eggheady nerd concern that law professors might debate?
I think it's actually a good idea to do, I wouldn't say to the exclusion. So if
Yeah.
policymakers had to devote their efforts
Yeah.
to non-generative AI or generative AI, I'd say 80 to 90% to generative AI, because it's starting to eclipse all the other ordinary areas of AI. So
Yeah.
it's starting to take over
Right.
all the other regular. So almost anything you can do in regular old narrow AI, you can now do with generative AI. And I'm speaking generative AI, not just text generation. There's kind of a class of deep learning transformers. These are all jargony things, but kind of this new class of technologies that can do new things that's surpassing the old stuff. So I think it is warranted.
Mhm. Now, as I said in the introduction, Harry, you have a fairly, not unique as in one person, but rare combination of background in computer science and law. And so I want to come back to some of these concepts. I want to dive right into what I mentioned in the introduction about these videos that you've put together, which I found very instructive. I'm going to play again. People on the radio will be able to hear this, be able to hear it. If you subscribe to the Hearsay Culture Network, you'll be able to see the video, but you can find them on YouTube. So I want to play for my listeners, both audio and video, one of your clips of one of your videos, and then we're going to talk about it. So again, these are on YouTube, and they're videos that Harry has put together demonstrating ChatGPT. This particular clip comes from about a year ago.
Now that it has converted the copyright laws into a series of rules, I'm going to ask it a legal hypothetical about copyright expiration that I would expect a law student in my IP class to be able to answer. As you can see, GPT-4 correctly applies the laws, determining that it is a single author book, that the term expires 70 years from the author's death at the end of that calendar year. I then gave it a slightly more complicated hypothetical where the author is also an employee to see if it could figure out that scenario too. GPT-4 applied the rules correctly there as well. I next gave it a legal hypothetical that my law students would find challenging, involving two authors and a joint work. Here, it also did a good job applying the laws to this example of a jointly authored book by a father and a young son. However, it did not pick up on one nuanced legal issue that my best law students would have spotted, whether the father and son's contribution were separable and therefore subject to different copyrights.
Now I'm going to stop there, Harry, because again, obviously, we don't need to get into the law per se, but I want to ask you some questions about these videos. And first, right, is why, right? What the impetus might be obvious, but I'm not sure it's completely obvious why you saw the need to do videos in this way, and what need you're trying to meet by posting these videos, right? Gratis, right? Anyone can access them via YouTube.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it was partly to tell the world about the big changes that were happening a year ago that were not on people's radar, particularly in the law arena, about how much AI had changed. So, much to my chagrin, I gave a talk right before this AI development in, say, August of 2022, basically saying, AI is limited and we don't really see a path going forward, maybe for the next, maybe 5 years out, we'll have AI systems that can understand natural language and be able to converse and maybe do legal analysis. And, I had egg on my face only 2 months later when out came ChatGPT, and then 7 months later came GPT-4. And I was trying to highlight the contrast between the state of the art only 6 months before and the way things had changed so much by March of 2023, when systems like GPT-4 were able to engage in the kind of complex legal reasoning and analysis that most people thought 6 months before were maybe 5 years or more in the future. So that was at least part of it, to say, look, this is a big development. You need to pay attention to it. And largely among law professors and policymakers, there wasn't the awareness of the application in law. The other reason I did is just general education. I'm a teacher and educator, and I like to spread knowledge. I myself watch a lot of YouTube videos from other speakers and educators out there, and I'm a visual learner, so I like to share that knowledge. And I'm going to continue to put out these videos because I spend a lot of time following the state of the art and in artificial intelligence and law, and I want to make this understandable to the broader public.
You say you had egg on your face, but of course, it seems like the entire world, save maybe, Bill Gates, Sam Altman, and the people inside of OpenAI and Microsoft, had egg on their face. I've asked this question of particularly of technologists. I'll ask you as well. You weren't aware of it? I wasn't aware of it, but did you talk to anyone prior to November 30, 2022, right? I'm not asking you obviously to reveal trade secrets if you talk to people at Microsoft and OpenAI, but anyone who wasn't connected with ChatGPT, who said, "Oh yeah, we're close to this," because I've yet to find those people. And I'm curious,
No, absolutely not. In fact, it was quite the opposite. So my research agenda for many years has been going back all the way to 2010, has been the application of AI to law in exactly this way. And I've been testing all the systems, whether it was, Meta released in early 2022, Galactica, Google had released a system called BERT. So I've been testing all the state of the art prior to ChatGPT, and all the evidence showed that it wasn't quite wasn't quite good enough. So almost everybody I know was surprised by how good ChatGPT was in November 2022.
Now you say almost, so I've got to ask you. I mean, you have to name.
Some people claim they weren't surprised, but I haven't really heard good reasons why. So anyone who had been following the field closely and had been studying it from afar, I think kind of had the same view I did.
Does it surprise you in light of that? Because again, what you're saying is consistent with everyone that I've spoken to who might have had such access, or at least known people who might have that. Does it surprise you that this was kept to such degree of trade secrecy and under wraps? Because it really blows my mind that, and I'm not doubting what you're saying, but it blows my mind that this was such a shock to everyone. Are you surprised by that? That by the fact that it was secret and the fact that it was apparently kept so well, right, from the public, that it surprised people like you and everyone else who'd been focusing on this work?
Yes, I am surprised because usually you can get a sense of where the state of the art is going by reading the papers, going to universities, listening to talks, which I did. What was interesting and different about this is they took existing technologies, which were well known, which I was familiar about, and just scaled it up with the private resources of Microsoft to a degree that no one had ever done this before. So I think that so they took technologies that we knew and scaled it to an extent behind closed doors, and I think it was kind of these emergent properties that only emerged at the larger scale that surprised everyone. But yeah, I mean, OpenAI and a lot of these companies these days are pretty good at keeping secrets. So right now, for example, GPT-5, the
Yeah,
next generation of GPT is being trained. It might have just finished training according to rumors, and there's nary a leak
right.
about it. And I'm sort of surprised and impressed. I mean, Apple for years has shown that they keep a tight grip on trade secrecy. So it
Right.
it is possible, but I am surprised that this didn't leak out earlier.
Where we're chatting with Professor Harry Surden of the University of Colorado School of Law on hearsay culture and the Hearsay Culture Network on KZSU.
And I
Yeah,
just a follow up. I want to give OpenAI credit,
yeah,
by the way, for releasing ChatGPT to the public because a lot of people think, hey, they released this thing and at all these risks. But in my personal view, the alternative wasn't that this thing doesn't get developed. It's that it gets developed in secret by corporations without revealing it to the public and not giving society time to deal with it. So the fact that OpenAI did a public reveal, I think is a big credit that it woke up society that this technology is going on. And you and I both know there's kind of a parallel track of alternative universe where there's um, a technology data broker technology that's been kept secret from the public the last 20 years being used by advertising companies and the public doesn't know about it by and large, or they don't know the extent to which the private information is. And it's not like the technology didn't develop, it just developed in private at a profitable level between corporation to corporation. So I give OpenAI credit for that.
so I'm glad he raised that because this is something that I've talked to a few people about, and I'm in my personal work, putting on my law professor and advocacy and writing hat I've been focusing on. So let me ask you this, I can certainly understand that point. However, does it bother you that Sam Altman made that decision for society? In other words, here's my pushback and a
Yeah.
critique. I'm curious what your response is. Right, we're coming. It's November 22. We're still dealing with COVID, right? I mean, it's not as acute as it was the year prior, but we're just kind of still coming out of lockdown. The world is reeling. We've got wars. Oh, I guess we always have wars, but we've got some wars paying attention to, and Sam Altman. And I don't think, and by the way, correct me if you think I'm being too simplistic. Sam Altman decides now is the time to release it. As much as we might give credit, and I want to come back to that as well, as much as we might give credit to OpenAI, does it bother you how this came to our attention and how it was released?
It doesn't particularly bother me. I think they were surprised by the reaction that ChatGPT got. I don't think they expected it to be quite the hit that it was. I mean, I think
That, that,
inevitably,
that almost sounds
yeah,
implausible, right?
yeah, that I mean that's what they say for I mean I think there's reason to believe that they were surprised because their servers were overwhelmed because if they expected it to be the hit that it was, they would have dedicated the bandwidth and server width for a hit and they were kind of scrambling for weeks. Um, but I think you're also right in they knew it was something big and they were releasing something big. I think they were surprised that the public quickly understood what a big deal it was. I'm trying to think. It's a good question. I mean, I think something like this would have been released within a year or two. So they made it public sooner. And I think maybe the critique is the alternative path is not for this to get released to society. It's that this technology would have been secretly sold from corporation to corporation, from Microsoft to some other corporation, and it would be being used and the public wouldn't know about it, right? So it's not like it's not released in society. It would be released in society beneath the public awareness.
But of course, Microsoft's backing this, Harry, as you know,
Right.
and Bill Gates, notwithstanding the Gates Foundation, I wouldn't call an altruist, right? The money they're putting in, they had to see dollar signs, no?
Right. Exactly. So I think bringing it to the public attention is the real credible thing they did. But it's an interesting question to think whether they did it the right way, whether looking, a year later, the kind of furor it's created in society, whether they would have done it differently or not. But I didn't find it particularly problematic.
Right. And I think, and look, and I think there's bigger issue there as well with regard to how technology might be rolled out. But I want to put that aside for a moment and ask you something more directly related to your response. So, as you know, the NTIA just last week, right, closed a window where this very issue, secrecy around code and AI, was one of the big issues. So Kevin Bankston authored a letter which I signed, by way of disclosure, I signed, that more or less argued, I want to get your response to it, that on this very issue of whether code around AI should be public. Right. In other words, should we be making this code public or should we be locking it down? Now, Bankston's letter, which a number of organizations signed, and I wasn't the only academic that signed it as well, basically argued that we're better off putting the technology out there publicly. And I'm not talking about using ChatGPT, but the code behind it, right? Making that public, using, right, open source open source code. And for those that aren't familiar, right, the kind of code that is freely accessible, right? Because it allows for a more democratic use of the technology, allows for creation and development, and it prevents, the argument suggests, right, the kinds of closed, right, secret creation and use of the technology by entities that might have nefarious intentions, right? I'm not talking about OpenAI now. I'm talking about countries and organizations, criminal organizations. Now, of course, the flip side position, as articulated by other experts, is that no, right? The technology is so powerful, right? It has so many downside risks that it's simply too dangerous. It's too powerful a technology to simply make public, right? And therefore, the secrecy or the tight control over the code is important. What's your opinion on those? I mean, they of course tie to a debate with which I know you're very familiar, that's been going on for decades, right? About security through opacity, right? Or security through secrecy. So yeah, what's your reaction to all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of have a middle ground position on this. I think open source in AI is very important, and surprisingly, Meta, which has not always been a socially positive organization through much of its history, is one of the companies primarily releasing the open models, primarily Llama 2. They're going to be releasing a Llama 3 version. Of course, they're doing it for profit-related interests in addition to maybe wanting to help society. So I think that's probably good. I'm not a believer in the concerns that this thing is so dangerous we can't release the open weights. I think that's a bit of a straw man that people hold out there. I generally believe that there's room for both closed source frontier models, as they call it, like OpenAI or Claude, Anthropic. And the reason is these are always going to be the highest performing models. And there are definitely risks involved in AI, and I don't want to diminish them, but there's a huge number of benefits, particularly in terms of science, in terms of research, medicine, all these different areas. And these frontier models, right now, OpenAI is rumored to have spent, maybe $1 billion training GPT-5, the next generation. I don't know that for a fact. That's just purely speculation. by the way. So, there's room for them to try and recoup the costs of that investment alongside, I think, the open source models, which are very important for academic research. So Llama 2 and some of these open source large language models have been really crucial to understanding how these things work. We actually don't really understand how these things work on the inside, why they produce the things that they do. And the open source ones, you can kind of peer inside and get a much better handle on how it's working. You can't do that with OpenAI or Anthropic because they're behind a server wall. So it's very much a mystery. So I'm sort of in the middle. I think there's room for both.
We're chatting with Professor Harry Surden of the University of Colorado School of Law, as well as Stanford's Codex on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. Stanford KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station, so donations are nice. So please consider making a donation to donations at kzsu.stanford.edu. So, Harry, as you know quite well, being also being an alumni of Stanford Law School, that KZSU is beaming, right, its radio signal right into, if not OpenAI, right, where the signal doesn't go all the way up to Washington State, but certainly to, right, a few other major players in the space. For those who aren't familiar, although many people I'm sure are, particularly in the Bay Area, all I'm sure know, Google is a few miles from the Stanford campus. Facebook is almost across the street. So I'm curious, you're literally, right, being beamed into these offices. And so, in light of what you just said, I'm curious, your advice to competitors, okay, and I know you've mentioned several, but interestingly, right, relatively, with the exception of Microsoft, these are kind of smaller players, right? I mean, which is really fascinating from an innovation standpoint, right? Again, Microsoft is obviously not, but to be clear, some of the major players in this space, I mean, who heard of OpenAI, perhaps, right? But even more, who heard of some of these other companies? And then you've got the giants, right, who appear at least publicly to be scrambling to catch up. And so I'm curious what you say to those companies, right? The behemoths that certainly you and I are used to, being around the internet world for shockingly, right, at least 20 years now, right, are not the ones we usually say are playing catch up, and here they are. Now we see, of course, Google, and I mean, again, they're all doing this work, and Mark Zuckerberg has mentioned the metaverse for quite a while in AI, but still, they're not the industry leaders, at least right now. That could change. What do you say to them in light of
Yeah,
what?
so I think Google is a really interesting example. So I've, admired a lot of the work that Google has done for a long time. In fact, most of the underlying, or many of the underlying technologies behind ChatGPT, the transformer, instruction fine-tuning, these are all technical things which I can talk about later. But the point being that Google actually invented these and also published these publicly. And Google continues to do a lot of publications of cutting edge research. But I think my personal opinion, what's going on at Google is they have an $80 billion a year search business that is so profitable that it's hard to disrupt. And AI is a disruptive model potentially to search, and that cash cow. So there's probably a lot of internal tension within Google that on the one hand, they have a great research team at DeepMind and Google Brain that produce great stuff, but they also don't want to upend this thing that's been producing $80 billion a year. And so Google, kind of has the innovator's dilemma problem, if you've ever heard that from Clayton Christensen, which I think a lot of the startups like OpenAI doesn't have. So it's an interesting question. Google recently came out with their state-of-the-art models, Gemini Ultra. I test them all very heavily. In my opinion, it's good, but not nearly as good as GPT-4 or even Claude 3. So the question is, could Google not make a better model and they put all their efforts, or are there some structural reasons where they're holding back a little bit? They have innovated. They have another model called Gemini Pro 1.5, which innovated by having 1 million tokens. So basically, you can throw a lot of information at it, much more than anyone else. So that's pretty innovative. But my general advice would be pay attention to the research. So there's a website called Archive run by Cornell University, which you and I know very well. And it's a preprint archive. Every day they put the latest research on AI, large language model technology. I look at it every day to keep up with the state of the art. And in the amazing thing about research and the public world is that all the ideas are out there for you to read and learn. It's hard. It's hard to do. It takes a lot of effort and it brings a lot of knowledge, but literally the best researchers in the world are giving out their best ideas. So if there's one critique I'd give about OpenAI, it's not that they haven't open sourced, which some people have said, it's that they're not publishing their research the way they used to. So, the OpenAI wouldn't exist if Google had not publicly released the paper on the transformer and instruction time fine-tuning in their FLAN paper, which OpenAI had built upon. So beaming into OpenAI's office right now, I would encourage them to give back to the intellectual community, share their ideas to the world the way, and they've done that to some extent. But for example, the GPT-4 paper was a technical report, but it didn't tell you how it worked or how they did it. They kept it a trade secret because it was too valuable. And while I understand that, that's not intellectually generous. And I would like them to be more intellectually generous the way a lot of these other, and Meta has been very intellectually generous as well.
And it's interesting, because I think, certainly Facebook, and I've been a critic, Google, I've also criticized at times, but it is a fair point that I don't think people appreciate, which is that both of those companies, particularly Google, have done quite a bit of work, not only in publishing, but also in creating, as altruistic as a for-profit entity can be, connections with the academic world. In other words, there is, and we, Devin Desai and others, right, had been employed by these companies to be liaisons with the academic world in ways that you don't often see in the technological space. Let me take advantage, Harry, with the time that we have left, in the fact that, again, it's not a platitude that you have been traveling, all over the globe, talking about generative AI over the last couple of years. Again, we're here in the United, at least you and I are in the United States, and the US yet again is driving this technology, but right, the rest of the globe, of course, is being impacted by it, and the EU, and we don't need to get into weeds of the law, but the EU has the AI Act, which is still being developed. I mean, it's going to be a few years before we really see what it does. But then, of course, there's a lot of concern, right, about actors that are less transparent, to put it mildly, right? Countries like China and Russia and others that also have this technology. As you travel around, how much of the geopolitics of generative AI are driving, in your view, the policy discussions around this technology?
Yeah, this is a great question. So about the AI Act in Europe, just to start for a moment, I have some critiques, and it's mainly because it was developed in the pre-generative AI era, and it had so much momentum. Rather than rethinking it in light of generative AI, which they should have done, they basically tacked on the old bill, which was, in my view, fine before generative AI. If this act had been passed circa 2018, risk-based, it would have been perfectly fine. In light of generative AI, which is much more multi-purpose, and it's not really meaningful to say what are the risks, it no longer makes sense to do it the way that they did it. But there was this sort of momentum that went ahead. So I'm a little critical of it. Maybe they'll be able to resolve it in rulemaking, but it is interesting. I do give them credit for trying to think about something. I do see real differences between the way the United States regulates and the way Europe regulates. Europe tries to be preventative, when it comes to technology, which is interesting. So they're trying to prevent future harms of AI that have not really arisen, whereas the United States has been more reactive, waiting for harms to arise and then coming up. I actually think that the US approach is better in this area, mainly because it's really hard to predict the harms ahead of time. So this is why I'm a little critical in the era of generative AI about ahead of time risk prediction. I've done a bunch of research about how good we are at predicting the harms of a technology when it comes out, and then the real harms that we wind up caring about, 10 or 20 years later. And it turns out we're very bad. And there are actual harms to missing the boat and acting too early, regulating harms that you think are going to arise and missing. So just a good example of this, if you go back to the policy discussions for social media, circa 2007, 2008, when, Facebook was just coming out, there were a lot of concerns, and some of which have arisen, so that people were worried about, isolation due to social media. People wouldn't have real friends; they'd only have online friends, or people were concerned about cyberbullying and things like that. So those have arisen, but they completely missed many of the other concerns that we're now worried about. So things like mental health issues of teens, spread of misinformation, political polarization, addiction. None of these things were on the table by and large in 2007. So had we proactively tried to regulate, we would have largely missed the boat. So I think there's a good analogy for AI here. There's a lot of things that people are worried about, but I think the real problems that arise, we unfortunately just have to wait and see and then deal with them then. And that's sort of an uncomfortable feeling, but I think that's really the best way to operate in these unpredictable technologies.
Now it's, to put it directly, Harry, it's not necessarily, to use the cliche, our ox that's going to be gored by the technology. So what do you say to those who say, to both of us, by the way, easy for you to pontificate, professors, but my job in coding is going to be gone in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an interesting point. I think employment raises its own special area that I've looked quite a bit, quite a different from some of the other issues like misinformation, AI misinformation, and deepfakes and AI bias and things of that nature. So employment is actually really complicated, and I'm actually writing a piece on this right now. So if
Great.
you look, I'm primarily following the work of MIT economists David Otter and Daron Acemoglu. And what they've done is sort of studied the history of technology and how it affects employment. And it actually turns out to be not very straightforward. So our instinct is that a new technology comes along, say a tractor, and it replaces manual labor, and those jobs just go away. And that's our sort of general way of thinking about technologies like AI, that sort of replacement mode. And that does sometimes happen, but that's not usually or often the way it happens. Sometimes it's kind of individual tasks that go away and then new tasks are created. Sometimes it actually increases the demand by increasing productivity or lowering costs. Sometimes it creates entirely new classes of jobs that people open up. So I think when it comes to AI and employment, we really don't know. There is, I think, at least a good a chance that it could increase demand or increase employment for many of these jobs that we actually think are going to decrease employment or decrease demand, although it could go that way as well. So I don't want to dismiss that out of right. So it is hard to predict. That's sort of the idea.
Yeah.
And you're very much right, though, that the flip side is when the problems happen, we need, as a society and as a world, to do something about it. So
Right.
say, in fact, programmers or artists get put out of work and they can't retrain and things happen. We can't ignore that by any means. And we, particularly in America, differently in Europe and Australia, other places I've lived where they have more robust social safety nets, particularly in America, we have not been good about helping people who fall through the cracks in their jobs and aren't able to pay the bills, aren't able to retrain or move for various reasons. So we need to care about those issues for sure.
We're chatting with Harry Surden of the University of Colorado on KZSU at the Hearsay Culture Network on Hearsay Culture. So, of course, we're both law professors. Harry, I got to ask, right? Our students, the ones that are paying attention anyway, are thinking, will I be out of a job in 5 or 10 years? Now, I don't know if there's anyone better to ask that question in light of the work that you've done. So take it from there.
Yeah. So this is where I think Otters and Asamoglu, the labor economists I spoke about from MIT, their framework really helps us think about this. So we've seen lots of technological disruptions in law. So take, for example, when lawyers used to look through books to do research, and then it switched to online searching through companies like Westlaw or LexisNexis. So there was a concern at that point in time that, wow, lawyers spend all this time researching through books. Now what used to take, a day, you can do in an hour on Westlaw. Are all these lawyers going to be put out of business? Again, a similar thing happened, which what's known as discovery for the non-lawyers out there. Discovery is legalese for looking through piles of paper. So a lot of what lawyers have to do in lawsuits are look through large boxes of documents, whether it's emails, they're looking for evidence or other related documents, or when there's two companies merge on the transactional side, they have to do what's known as due diligence, make sure there are no hidden surprises, financial or otherwise. So it basically involves looking through lots and lots of documents. Circa, when you and I were in law school, a recent law grad at a big law firm would be placed in a basement, and they would sit for hours looking through boxes of documents, and then they would bill the client at $200, $300, $400 an hour for looking through paper.
Or in my case, a windowless conference room.
A window, exactly. So then along came electronic discovery, this, kind of parallel to electronic research, and what you were able to do, what it used to take you a week, you could do in 3 hours. So there's a lot of concern about that. So what Otter and Asamoglu show us is that that's example of tasks being replaced, and those are sort of productivity augmenting jobs, but they're not necessarily job replacing. So that what that did was it allowed freeing up labor of lawyers to do all the other tasks that lawyers can do. So lawyers do lots of things. They help clients think through legal problems, they do legal analysis, they do problem solving, they do negotiation, they do counseling, they do listening. So when you do these productivity enhancing, sometimes they increase the ability to do other jobs, or they do quality increases. So lawyers are able to do their job better actually than they could in the paper world when maybe they would have missed research. So it's kind of a complex dynamic. So my overall thought is lawyers are not going to be out of a job for this reason. I think lawyering will be different in the same way that, we now lawyering using electronic search and lawyering using e-discovery and email looks different than lawyering in the 1960s. But I think there will fundamentally always be a need for people to deal with the law. Companies will still merge, and lawyers will be there using these AI tools to produce better quality, more augmented research. I think maybe at the margins, there are certain tasks. So the same way you wouldn't want to have specialized in paper document review back in 2006. And if that's all you could do, you'd be in trouble. But we train our lawyers, hopefully, in the panoply of lawyering tasks, of which there are many.
Are you, I have a few more questions in this vein. So in your classes, can students use ChatGPT?
Yes. So I'm teaching a seminar now where we're experimenting. This is a seminar.
I want to ask about that, but let me be clear. Non-technology law or computer related. So let's say you're teaching contracts or torts or something like that. Do you have policies aside from classes where you would want to focus on?
Yeah, this is a great question. So our official policy is no AI on the exam, and then professors can use it as they wish. I'm experimenting with it for pedagogical purposes in my non-technology law classes. I actually think it's an incredible resource because it can be your ever patient tutor. So something like GPT-4, and I want to emphasize, only in the last year and a half has AI reached the level where it can actually be a useful tutor. And a lot of people don't appreciate, just 3 years ago, this wasn't even a discussion we could be realistically happening.
Right.
So I'd say the one problem with law school, particularly the beginning.
I want to be clear. Tutor how? Like
Oh, okay. So,
yeah.
say you had, so a lot of what we do in law school, especially the first year, is give our students little bite-sized, what they call legal hypotheticals. So this will be, as you know this as well as I do, this will be a set of facts, say in tort law, which is accident law. Somebody's driving down the road and a branch falls in the road, and we give it to the students while we're teaching them, like, tell us how this works out legally. And at first, the students have no idea how to do this in the first couple of weeks, but slowly, towards the end of the semester, they begin to look for the laws and what laws are relevant and how to apply them, and then kind of reason through on both sides, what are the likely outcomes. But we do this largely by modeling it for students in front of the classroom, right? We walk through cases. We say, here's a particular case, somebody got injured or this contract was broken, and here are the laws. Here's what the judges thought, and this is the outcome. What do you think? But we don't often give them as much practice and individual Q&A as we would like. We do a little bit, but I teach classes of somewhere between 60 and 90 students. I can only do so much. So what AI can do, something like GPT-4, is you can give one of these hypotheticals, then the student can write here's what I think it is, and then GPT-4 can say, no, that's not quite right. Did you try this? And the student can be like, I don't really understand what the reasonable person standard is in law. And then GPT, well, here's what it is, just as a reminder. So it can be this patient, interactive tutor helping walk the students in. It's not really a substitute for a professor, but it can supplement the professor, allowing the student to ask questions that maybe they didn't have time to ask in class, or were too embarrassed to ask in class.
So why shouldn't, and we only have a few minutes left, Harry.
Oh yeah,
talk about,
sure.
Well, why shouldn't I be now very concerned for my job?
So I think for the
my job being law professor.
Yeah. So for the same reason, I think lawyers should not be afraid. It's more of a complement than a substitute for being a professor. So I think it's kind of, a lot of people were worried in the era of when YouTube came out in 2005 or so, that the videos like I make would start supplementing education, generally speaking. But I think the argument back then was, oh, why would you bother going to law school if you could just watch a video on law? And I think there has been a little bit of substitution effect, but by and large, people still find value in the structure and the human interaction of law school. Some significant set of people want to talk to the professor and kind of get that extra insight that maybe AI isn't providing or giving the background. So I think that right now, at least, we can think of AI as this super TA that's out there helping the professor answer questions they didn't have time to get to, but it's not going to really anytime soon, I think, substitute for the experience of being in the classroom and having the knowledge transfer and interaction with the individuals and the students.
It's what I had Victor Mayer Schomburger on the show last week talking about his new book Guardrails, and he was talking about protecting humanity, right? And I think he also, he has that concern about protecting humanity, but that's kind of what he describes. So in the last couple of minutes here, Harry, and again, there's so much to talk about, but I want to ask you this. I've spent a lot of time on some of the risks. Of course, you've alluded to, and I've alluded to, the positives. And so, which are many, and one which has already manifested itself is access to justice, right? In other words, the ability for ChatGPT to craft at least basic serviceable documents, right, and answer legal questions for people that don't have access to lawyers, right, because they can't pay or what have you, right, is an enormous relative leveling of the playing field. I mean, relatively speaking, for reasons you already mentioned, it's not the same as having a lawyer. But I'm curious, as you know, as we see Lexis and Westlaw putting their own AIs out there. Obviously, we see lawyers trying to use AI sometimes with terrible results because of the hallucinations, right? The making up of case sites, right? And cases, and then they go into briefs. But you're a good person to ask this question. I don't normally ask a crystal ball question, and this is as close as I get. But given your background and experience, if you were to hazard an educated guess as to what lawyers can expect in the near term horizon, I don't want to go too far out, but I'd say even within the next 5 years, how do you see, other than, or do you see, other than what you've already mentioned, changes in the practice of law that we should, as law professors and law students, be thinking about as we go into the field? I'm not asking for 20 years, because who knows, right? We could have flying cars and all the things that we prognosticated past. But within the next 5 years, what do you say? Where do you see
Yeah.
things?
This is a great question. So let me first talk about the access to justice
Yeah.
piece. This is a topic I'm really passionate about. So 80%, it's estimated that 80% of people in the United States who have a legal problem can't afford or don't have access to a lawyer on the civil side. On the criminal side, it's appointed for you, but most matters are civil. These are things like immigration, family law, landlord tenant. So at Stanford, at the center that the Codex Center, we're working on a free and open source project using GPT-4 and some of these large language models, working with organizations like Legal Aid, which are nonprofit lawyer organizations, to help provide answers to people who can't access lawyers for free, to try and expand this, because these legal aid lawyers are amazing, but they don't have the capacity. And I think where we are right now, and probably in the near term, is that AI in law, when it comes to solving legal problems or answering legal problems, can do a pretty good job at what I call easy cases. So it turns out that a lot of law, and lawyers and law professors don't like to admit this, are easy cases. And what that means is this is something that a lawyer could give you a pretty confident answer in 5 minutes, and most lawyers would agree with, but a non-lawyer would still be very confused and would have no idea. That's to be contrasted with a lot of what lawyers do are hard cases. These are things that involve a lot of high-level problem solving, legal analysis. This is what lawyers get paid the big money for. But they also have a lot of easy cases. So AI has shown the remarkable ability to give easy answer cases, provided they have the right guardrails, which I can talk about what we're doing. So looking in the future of lawyer and lawyering, I think easy cases in law, things where there's clear answers, are starting to go away. That's the bread and butter of a lot of lawyers today. For example, in certain areas of law, like landlord-tenant law, and or sort of areas of contract drafting. So I think that will go away, and then lawyers can devote their time to more harder, complicated cases. So I think we as lawyers should be focusing on our value added, which is problem solving, interpersonal skills, thinking through issues, high level legal analysis, and that's where things are going. But right now, as you noted, the AI still has enough problems that you have to be very careful. So the analogy I like to give is, think about the state-of-the-art system, GPT-4, as a extremely highly capable third-year intern, right? This is somebody who can give you an amazing first draft, but you would never take the draft of a third-year law student and turn it directly into a client or turn it into a judge without extremely double checking. On the other hand, a third-year law student can give you an incredible head start compared to starting with a blank page. So that's where it's a good way to think about AI, right? An AI can draw a draft contract, it can do draft legal analysis, but you want to double check the veracity of everything before you turn it into the judge or turn it over to a client. So that's where I think things are going.
Harry, it's been wonderful having you on the show. Professor Harry Surden of the University of Colorado School of Law and Stanford's Codex. So much more to talk about, but we have run out of time. And so I'm going to simply thank you for joining me on the Hearsay Culture Network, and thanks for coming back.
Thank you, Dave. It's an honor and a pleasure to be back here.
The Hearsay Culture Network can be found at hearsayculture.com, where Denise Howell and I are putting up new shows, so check it out there. Otherwise, thank you for listening today to Hearsay Culture. Please stay tuned for more diverse programming on KZSU, and have a great day.